want your soul.
It was my wife who suggested the role play, despite what she may say elsewhere. You'll just have to decide who you think is being honest here. When she first suggested acting out our roles, I was hoping for pigtails and pleated skirts, but I should have figured that it wasn't going to be like that. If I'm honest, there isn't much that I wouldn't have agreed to at that point in our marriage. Things weren't bad, but they weren't good either. One morning I woke up to a packed lunch and an orange juice on the breakfast table, and when I tried to make myself a cup of coffee, she told me that growing boys shouldn't drink things like that. I typically skipped breakfast and headed out the door each morning, but the way she sat there looking at me made me feel like I was missing something. It took me a minute to realize that this right here was the start of our little pretend play, so I sat down and ate the cereal and drank the juice. The whole scene made me a little uncomfortable. I guess I just felt like I was put on the spot. Sounds weird, but I've always had a bit of a thing about people cooking for me. My mom died when I was 8. My dad didn't really pay me much attention. I had to cook and clean and iron my uniform every night before school, and no one ever did my homework for me. Later on, my dad married some poor waitress half his age and treated her like a servant, and I realized that must have been exactly how he had treated my mom. I'm not saying that this taught me to be the perfect man or anything, far from it. I just didn't like things that made me feel like I was becoming my dad. But there was my wife, making me cereal for breakfast and then handing me a neat little lunchbox with cartoons on it that I'd watched as a kid. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, that was a throwback. And I'd be lying if I said I didn't like some part of this. Driving to work that day, I decided that this role play was probably just some kind of therapy, and that it was best to just go along with it, even after I got home that night to find that she'd run me a bath. Not only did she want me to be a clean little boy, she'd even laid out some brand new pajamas for me. It was deeply uncomfortable. She perched on the toilet lid while I was sat upright in the tepid water, not sure what to do with myself. A grown man with a beer belly hunched over in gray water. I felt kind of stupid. "Do you need help washing yourself up, honey?" she cooed. Sure," I replied, and she came over and pulled out a fish-shaped bottle of No Tears shampoo. Wow, she's not fucking around, I thought. She washed my hair using a plastic cup to rinse my scalp. I had to lean back for her to get it all. Didn't want any of that getting in my eyes, even though it was no tears. And she held my head in her hands. I hated it. My eyes wouldn't stay shut, her hands were too cold, the water too warm, and the porcelain of the tub too hard. And every time the water flowed over my head, I would lurch forward and try to sit up, which of course meant I got suds in my eyes. "Shh," she kept saying, "just lie back, it won't hurt. I won't let it," she'd say. So I laid back and controlled my breathing and told myself that it was for her sake, not mine. One of the last memories of my mom was her reading a book while I sat in the bathtub, and I guess I didn't like how it felt in my wife's arms at that moment. But she just kept talking to me in that soothing voice, and somewhere along the lines I let go of conscious thought and focused on the sensation of the warm water rolling down my scalp. "You can let go," she said, wiping some water from my face, and when I looked up at her I realized that I was shaking and my heart was pounding. All of a sudden it all just came out, all the tension, all the anxiety, the constant state of near panic that I'd suppressed for my entire life. You're meant to say that this kind of stuff feels cathartic, but I hated it. It made me feel physically sick, even a little ashamed. She held me in her arms while I sobbed like a baby in the tub, and when it was finally over, all I could think was, thank God I can breathe again. I let her dry me as I stood dripping wet on the tiles, and then I let her dress me in the cool, dry pajamas she'd laid out ready, the silky fabric raising goosebumps on my skin. By the time I curled up into bed, her arms cradling my head like it was a precious jewel, I was exhausted like I'd just gone for a quick 30-mile run. The last thing I remember was the theme song to Scooby-Doo, and the flood of nostalgia combined with the feel of fresh bed linen putting me to sleep hard and fast. The next day at work, I felt dirty, and I didn't much enjoy the thought of going home. I knew what was waiting for me, and sure enough, she was there with SpongeBob pajamas, brand new ones, in one hand and a plate of food in another. At first I told her I wasn't up for it that night, but she told me to stop being silly and sit down and eat my food. And well, the food did look pretty good. And stupid as this is, I told myself it was doing me a favor. You know what I mean? Like if I just agreed to have her do all this stuff for me, it would be okay, so long as I agreed begrudgingly. So I ate the food and wore the clothes, and I tried not to cringe when she called me her baby boy. As much as I hated it, she was being really nice to me, and I just wanted her to like me again, to love me again. She hadn't liked me in so long, and this whole messed up business meant that she was being genuinely affectionate towards me again. For years, she'd always kind of looked at me like I was a dick. I don't know where, but somewhere along the lines I stopped being her husband and just became a husband. Just another emotionally stunted guy with a receding hairline. I could have been more attentive, I do know that, but nobody told me how exhausting mediocrity is, and by the time I got through, barely surviving work each day, I'd find very little energy left to give to her. I felt lonely all the time, and something about being in her arms made me feel a little less alone. I secretly hoped that this role play was about dismantling the walls we'd both put up. It wasn't on my terms. I would have picked literally anything else. But hey, when is life ever fully on anybody's terms? Being in love really means being held hostage. And yeah, things were bad. But man, I fucking loved her and everything I had. So I had to work with this. And what I had was this weird role play. I figured that it made some sense that some women didn't want a daddy. That instead some women actually wanted to be a mommy. You see it online all the time, right? Daddy this, daddy that. You can't throw a stone online without finding some pornographic image of a woman being fantasized. So why couldn't it go the other way around? So long as it wasn't sexual. I figured I could do it. I'd wear the pajamas, watch cartoons, and ask for help coloring in the lines. In the end, I didn't just go along with it for a few nights. I went along with it every single day that followed, and I found that every day there was a little more of it to go along with. The packed lunches became more elaborate. The food I ate grew simplified until it was practically the kind of stuff you'd feed a toddler. And one Friday night, when I finally told her I wanted a break, she just told me to stop being silly and to continue. She used that phrase a lot during the role play, and this is going to sound really stupid, but she made me feel really stupid when she said it. Her voice immediately made me feel small and ashamed, just like I had in the bath, and before I even realized I was doing it, I was sliding the pajamas on and booting up my Xbox while she messed around in the kitchen. I'd actually planned on talking to her that night about going to couples therapy, but she spoke to me like a little boy and I couldn't stop myself from reacting like one. It was like I was being trained. That weekend I listened to her tell me stories as I sat on the counter kicking my legs, and I think I felt something die inside me. On some level, I have to take some responsibility here. I ate the food I wanted to eat, and when she asked if there was anything I wanted, I always had something to say. I watched the TV I wanted and wore the clothes she put out for me, and pretty soon I got used to not thinking about those things. Pretty soon, every single day was spent with her. Some nights were movie nights, and we'd watched her favorite movies while she told me all about the memories she had of first watching them. Some nights were mommy nights, where she'd sit and drink wine and watch her own shows while I played games. We made forts out of cushions crammed in the backyard, played cowboy and Indian using Nerf guns, and chased each other around the house for hours at a time doing hide and seek or some homebrew version of tag. If I had to describe this time, it was like being in a waiting room, only I didn't have a number or a clock or any way of knowing how much time had actually passed. The only way I could even tell that time was passing was that I lost a lot of weight. In fact, a ton of it. My wedding ring started to slip off my finger one day, and where it went after that, I'll never know. I still don't understand this part of it, but I remember that I just kept getting thinner. For about 3 weeks I fell ill with some stomach bug, and I spent my days in bed watching Teletubbies while she checked my temperature and fed me chicken soup. And by the time I came out of it, I was wearing a child's large set of pajamas. I mean, how does that even work, right? I started the year weighing about 246 pounds. In the end, I got down to 98 pounds. Not only that, but my hair started getting thin and downy, and I couldn't even remember when I'd last needed to shave. I asked her about this one day, and she played dumb, like she didn't know what was happening to me. But out of the two of us, she must have known because it was literally right in front of her eyes. I was changing. She recommended that I stay home until I felt 100% myself again, which of course meant that I never went back to work, because I never, ever felt like myself again. Looking back, it wouldn't surprise me if she forged a resignation letter of mine or did something similar to keep me at home. Either way, by the time my stomach bug had passed, I was trapped in that house. The outer gate that had once barely reached my chest now towered over my head, and I could barely get my fingers around the bars. It wasn't a new gate, or at least I didn't think it was. It was just somehow taller than me all of a sudden. Things stopped making sense around this time, and looking back, it's hard to disentangle certain memories and ideas. I don't even remember the crib arriving. It was just there one day, along with a whole new room in the house that physically shouldn't have been there. I checked one night when I felt lucid, and sure enough, the bathroom and master bedroom had magically shrunk by 50%. But somehow a whole new room had just sprung up between them, and it was painted in baby blue, and the walls were covered in paintings of airplanes, and if I stared at them too long, I'd feel really sleepy and my head would get heavy, and boom. The next thing I'd remember, it'd be morning, and I'd be staring at a huge bowl of cereal. Whole chunks of time were purged from my head, and not just the recent stuff either. I was an accountant who suddenly couldn't do long division and struggled with his multiplication tables. Normally, my brain was like a cacophony of fireworks that took every ounce of my willpower to keep it under control. Stray thoughts just pinged off all the time, and it was chaotic, but it was me. But with my wife and with everything going on, it had turned into something more like a cobweb and holes poked in it. You know when you listen to someone and their voice just turns into a drone and you realize that you stopped listening after a few words? It was like that, but with my own thoughts. As soon as I got any momentum going, I lost interest and time faded, and I'd come to a few hours later, bouncing up and down on my wife's knee. I could practically feel bits of my mind sloughing away like candle wax, leaving big patches of nothing behind, and it hurt so bad. It hurt worse than anything physical that ever happened during that messed up time. Something was cutting my mind up like a scrapbooker going at old magazines, and I could feel it happening in real time. There were times when she'd take something off me, like the remote, and put it on the counter, and it'd just hang there over my head, and that just doesn't make sense to me. And the harder I concentrate to try and figure that out, the more it feels like staring right at the sun, and it just wasn't me. There were a couple of moments when she'd look at me and I wouldn't see my wife. Actually, that's not right. She was my wife. She was absolutely 100% my wife. She just had an extra pair of limbs. What I do know was as the time went on, I felt less like precious cargo and more like a leaden weight she had to lug from place to place. Some nights I'd wake up and spot her standing in my doorway looking at me, and the expression on her face, it was murderous. I'd have to lie there and pretend for hours that I was snoring gently, because on some level I just knew something bad was coming. The time we spent together started to change, and more often than not, I'd try to stay out in the garden and play with my toys. Only I wasn't really playing. I was just pretending, hoping that if my performance was good enough, then she wouldn't get any more irritated with me. Without knowing when, why, or how, rules were introduced. I'd go to do something like make myself a drink and stop, hand frozen halfway to an empty glass, and remember that I wasn't allowed to get glasses out of the cupboard myself. I didn't know how I knew that, I just knew it. I wasn't allowed to play games past 7 either. I wasn't allowed to get my own snacks. I wasn't allowed in the garden without telling her where I was going. And if I broke these rules, one time I threw a ball and broke a window and she exploded out of that screen door like a fucking bull. I was terrified of her. She was meant to be looking after me. Those were the roles we were meant to be playing. But she grabbed me by my arm and pulled it so hard it popped right out of the socket, and I begged for the game to stop, but nothing I said could snap out of it. These were some fucked up roles that she made. She dragged me into the house and I passed out around about the time my head bounced off the 3rd step on our porch. When I woke up, I was sitting in a high chair and strapped in real good. Something hurt, but I ignored it. All I wanted was for this pissed off woman to love me again. I was so terrified I would have done anything she asked. She was the only thing I had to keep me safe in the world, and my head was full of all the amazing stuff she did for me. The food, the gifts, the movies, the clothes, the bathing. I could see how tired she was. It was me making her tired. So I cried and sobbed, and I said sorry so often my throat got sticky and dry and I started to heave. When her terrible frown finally broke, she ran towards me with her arms wide open and pulled me out of that chair. She told me to never make me hurt her again, saying it over and over again as she sat me down on the sofa, rolled up my pajamas to show my chubby legs, and gave me a spanking. When I looked down at my legs, something was jutting out of my skin, and before I could figure out what it was, she pinched it with her finger and thumb and drew it out in one long motion. It was a needle. A little sewing needle that had been slid painfully into the thick fatty muscle of my thigh. "There needs to be some rules around here," she said, "and there's going to be some consequences too, but don't worry. I want you to know it hurts me just as it hurts you. We're both going to suffer when you break the rules, and I want you to know that you didn't just hurt yourself. You hurt me too," she said. After she gave me the spanking, I watched as she placed the bloody needle on her tongue and swallowed it. When the doorbell rang, I was looking at the diapers around my waist. I didn't know when or how they had gotten there, and weirdly I remember thinking the exact same thing that morning and the morning before that. The longer I thought about it, the harder it was for me to remember when I'd actually last used a toilet. The realization horrified me, some of the memories flashing into my head. It was like I was experiencing them for the first time all over. The timid woman I'd married was somehow suddenly so strong, able to not only overpower me, but able to actually lift me off the ground. She could pick me up and lay me down on a small table and hoist my legs up and, oh my God, she's changed me, I thought, and my whole body flushed with unspeakable humiliation. I think it was that feeling that let me keep my head together when the delivery man came. Like I had this little bit of defiance to stop me from trying to hide from a stranger. This is my chance, I thought. Wait, no, I'm not allowed to open the door, not for strangers. If I do that and I break the rules again, she's going to give me another spanking. But I can speak to him though, maybe he can help. Someone has to help me. If she comes and finds me though, I'm going to be in big trouble, and I don't want to be in trouble. It was like being drunk or having my thoughts handcuffed to a maniac. I had to fight every step of the way to stay a man and not a child, and I pulled at the handle eager to get some perspective on what was happening to me. Only, I never got to even see the guy because that was when the bathroom door slammed shut. She's coming, and I knew that if she found me then I'd get one hell of a punishment, maybe even worse than a spanking. My legs and arms already hurt so bad. I wasn't a very good boy, I knew. I broke a lot of the house rules, and it didn't help me that new ones were popping up all the time. I fled towards the kitchen, turning the corner just in time for the door to swing open and for this delivery guy to get a good look at me. I briefly turned to face him, and the way he reacted to the sight of me, I expected to feel embarrassed, but I just felt scared. Something was happening to me, and the fact that this guy could see it made it horrifyingly real. My body had changed, and no matter what my wife wanted, I wasn't a child. I was changing into something, but it wasn't a normal kid. And this wasn't Benjamin Button either. Whatever happens when you cram a chubby middle-aged guy into a 3-foot package, the result isn't a cute little kid. It's a fucking nightmare. I ran crying from the look in his eye and got as far as the garden when I heard my wife thunder into the living room. "Who let you in?" she cried. "I have children in this house. Who are you and why are you in my home?" I could hear him stammering away as I ran under the porch steps and waited. I'd learned this was one of the few places where she couldn't physically fit. The few times I'd hidden under there, she'd had to calm herself down, and that made things a little easier on me, at least in the short term. Now I hoped it'd keep me safe long enough that I could maybe even make a break for it when the guy left the gate. She'd child-proofed it with some infuriating mechanism that my fat fingers couldn't work, but it sure did take a long time for that gate to swing open and closed, and that right there was the best chance I was ever going to get. "Get out of my house," she screamed at him as she flew down the steps. She followed, hot on his heels. "Who's your manager? Who do you work for? I want to put in a complaint. I want you to know exactly how goddamned badly you've messed up," she screamed. This guy was stuttering and mumbling and fumbling, unsure of whether to run away or turn and give this woman a decent account of himself. I hoped he would leave. I was hidden so well, and if he opened that gate, then I would finally have a chance to get the hell away from this living nightmare. This guy was still trying to answer when my wife stepped down onto the path and turned to me slyly, raising one eyebrow right in my direction where I thought I was hidden. Oh, the terror I felt. I pissed myself, all over my diaper. I thought I'd got one over on her, but she knew the whole time and she had something planned. "Look at this," she said. Look at this step. This wasn't damaged until you came along," she said. The guy looked confused as hell, and I couldn't blame him. It was like he was grasping at air to understand everything he'd seen. It wasn't just my wife going off at him. It was the memory of what he'd seen. It was the memory of me. He bent down to take a look, and my wife encouraged him to get closer. I wondered why she was making him get so close to my hiding spot. Did she want to humiliate me? Did she want to parade the little freak around? I thought she must have known how much my body upset me, and she was going to use that fact to torture me a little bit. But it was nothing that tame. Without warning, his face slammed into the middle step, his head bouncing off like a coconut. Only she was there ready to catch it, and before either one of us could figure it out, she had shoved his head right back against the wooden step. He started to swear, then shout, then cry, and then finally he screamed, and screamed, and screamed some more. It lasted so long. She never stopped pushing, and somehow, impossibly, he started to give away. The sides of his skull started to crumple, his eyes bulged, his teeth popped out and fell to the floor like coins from a slot machine. I had to pull my legs up just to keep them from landing on my bare feet. I had front row seats to the worst fucking horror show I could ever think of, watching that guy get scalped in slow motion. Only it didn't stop at his head. She kept pushing until his shoulders started to pop and crack. His arms bent backwards and bones snapped. In the end, he poured out of that little 6-inch gap and fell onto the floor in a quivering pile of skin and flesh. The only thing left on the other side was my wife's face staring at me through the gore-coated wood. "Come on," she grinned. "Put your new toy away and I'll make you some lunch." I was sitting outside pretending to watch the clouds go by, aware that she was behind the kitchen window and pretending to wash the dishes. She was looking right at me, even if I couldn't see her. I'd watched her clean that guy up, watched her dump him in an old compost pile around the backyard. He wasn't the only one down there. I saw my old clothes, my laptop, my phone, my keys, my mail, everything that used to be me. And I'm not just talking about things. I'd never really thought much of it, but I'd shrunk and changed, and I guess all that meat and bone and fat had to go somewhere. I just hadn't realized that she'd tied it up in dripping bedsheets and plopped it at the farthest point in our yard. I didn't know how to explain it. I just knew it was me down there. Bits of me I'd never get back because it had been sun-baked into leathery offal. Couldn't even begin to tell you how it feels to grieve your own body like that. Whatever defiance I had was gone, especially after seeing what she did to that delivery guy. Coming to terms with who, or rather what I was, meant that I lost all desire to escape. I would have tried to overdose if it wasn't against the rules for me to go anywhere near the medicine cabinet. I ran a thumb across the purple and yellow flesh of my thigh, the skin riddled with 1,000 infected puncture marks. Can't break these rules, I thought. When a frisbee floated freely over the hedge, I stared at it for a minute like I was a disinterested cat. My eyes tracked it, but nobody was home upstairs, if you get what I mean. Only when it landed gently on the grass and I heard the gate cling open did it dawn on me that I wasn't alone out there. It was a little girl, and her reaction wasn't all that different to the delivery man's. She stopped dead in her tracks and started to cry a loud, distressed wail. I wanted to ask her for help, but I didn't want to face the way that she looked at me, so I quietly scuttled off towards the bushes to hide. Or at least I started to. That was when I heard the screen door bang and my wife came down the steps with a big smile on her face. "Oh, it's okay," she cooed, reaching out to hold the girl. Only our visitor couldn't see the kitchen knife my wife clutched behind her. "I won't let anyone ever hurt you." When she started walking towards our kitchen door, something broke. I felt a special kind of hatred burning inside me. It wasn't a defiance so much as it was pure spite and anger. The kind of feeling that'd make you scream, "I hate you," over and over at your parents just to see them hurt. It sounds stupid, but as much of a part of me that wanted to keep that little girl safe, another part of me was just plain old jealous. After everything my wife had done to me, I couldn't bear the thought of her bringing another child into the house. I started to run towards the two of them, and my wife, spotting me, hoisted the girl up into her arms. Only that slowed her down so much that I reached them before she'd even got up the step first. I tried to grab the girl's coat when I jumped up, but wound up grabbing a fistful of hair. Everything that happened next was a jumble, but my wife slashed my arm and wrist with that big knife of hers, and I pulled so hard on the poor girl's head that a load of her hair came free in my arm. In the end, I think it helped because this girl started screaming like hell, and when she got a good look at me, that was when the fear really kicked in and she started wriggling and kicking and punching. And my wife, who really wasn't ready for just how hard it can be to hold a pissed off kid, ended up dropping her. Once her feet were on the ground, that kid just zipped right out of the house, and I did everything I could to keep my wife away from her. It wasn't a whole lot, but I think it helped. I think between the way my messed up appearance got the girl running and the way I managed to hold on to my wife's legs for long enough to trip her up a little, I think I saved that kid. Looking back on everything that my wife cost me, I guess that was one of the few victories I ever had. As soon as the gate clanked shut, all that feeling of triumph dribbled away. I crawled back towards the porch steps as quick as I could, and the best way to describe it is that even though I wasn't looking at her, when my wife's eyes found me, I could feel them. Her rage. It must be what it's like to stand next to radioactive waste. I swear my shoulder got darker and the ground got a little hotter, in the noises I heard. They didn't sound like they came from an upset woman. Not sure what they sounded like really, except maybe a strange kind of clicking. When I finally got into the house and turned, I saw that she looked big enough to crush a man like a bug. I don't know how to describe it except it was like looking at something with 3D glasses, or the way your eyes feel funny just before a big migraine. I guess for a second I saw her as something that wasn't human, but the part of me that really hurts my head is that she never changed. It was the same entity I'd married on the altar, only now I got the feeling I did looking at dead spiders or leathery roadkill. She'd never really been human, had she? And with my memory shot to shit, I wasn't even willing to bet that I'd even married this thing. You read about those parasites that lay eggs in their hosts. Looking at her as she scuttled towards me, yeah, I got the sense that's what she was. Some kind of fucking animal, some parasite. She stopped just a few inches from the steps, her face peering at me through the gaps. She blinked with a third set of eyelids and smiled so wide, her skin started to lose its color and break. "I will drown you in my womb," she said, as calmly as she would ask if I wanted a cup of hot dogs in my spaghetti. And I believed her. I didn't come out of those stairs for the rest of the day, not even when my wife stood out on the porch and called me in for dinner. I didn't like my chances with whatever was shambling around there and pretending to be a wife or a mother or whatever else it felt like. I didn't want anything she made me, and as time wore on, I found that the hunger in my stomach sharpened my mind so that I didn't mind it so much. Besides, I could hazard a guess that she wasn't being honest about what was in my food, and I didn't want anything she made. Whatever this was, it wasn't really a game now. The stakes were too high, and for me, tucked away under those steps with my stomach growling and my mind growing more lucid with every passing second, I really started to hate her guts. I hated that she'd hurt me when she was supposed to protect me. I hated that she lied every second of the day until this sick little plan of hers came to fruition. But more than anything, I hated her for what she'd done to me. I wasn't a man, but I sure as hell wasn't a child. I was more like a monster and a joke, and I just knew that somehow she'd be the one stripping meat and fat off my bones until my frame withered to its pitiable size. I needed to leave. I had to. She'd since locked the gate and I needed the key, and if she stopped me, well, I guess I needed a knife too, didn't I? I needed something to keep me safe. I waited until sunset and crawled out from under the house, making sure to stick to the shadows. Peeking through the kitchen window, I saw her standing there with a plate in one hand and a blank expression on her face. She looked a little bit broken, like she didn't quite know what to do now, and I wouldn't listen to her cries of dinner time either. She just stood there and shivered until some flicker of movement caught her eye and she pivoted around to track it like a bird. I had to drop out of sight more than once because of how sensitive she was to changes in the light. Although I think I managed to avoid her little line of sight because when I finally snuck into the house via the back door, she was in the exact same spot, staring into the darkness like a blind man. For a moment I thought I was safe in the shadows, but whatever this thing was, it didn't seem so committed to playing human. As soon as I got near the stairs, her eyes fixed on me like a hound's and she came barreling forward on every limb she had. What little of her was visible in the moonlight almost looked fish-like, like she'd been pulled out of the bottom of a lake. She still had the general shape of a person, I guess, only it was like something wearing a human suit, one that was falling apart. Her joints slipped up and down her bones like they were on a pulley, and they bent backwards and forwards and sideways. As she got closer, I smelled her, and it was like rotten milk and dog shit left in a hot car. It hit me hard enough to water my eyes and make climbing the stairs difficult. Of course I didn't get very far. Between my short legs and the sight of her coming at me, I didn't have a chance. I got maybe 4 steps up before she grabbed my ankle with one hand and hauled me back downstairs. She mounted me, legs on either side, and slowly undid part of her sundress. I didn't know what the hell was going on, nor did I have the strength to fight it. The last thing I remember was the sight of her ribs pressing against her skin like fingers trying to poke through a rubber sheet, like they were alive inside of her and wanted out. "Does baby need some milk?" she asked before grabbing my head and slamming it into her chest, knocking me out cold. I awoke with an awful taste in my mouth. I'd been strapped into the high chair, and I looked around groggily until I laid eyes on a baby bottle. The congealed contents were the color of a smoker's fingers, with visible lumps of pink matter lurking towards the bottom like syrup in a milkshake. "Oh, that's straight from the source," my wife said, her misshapen fingers stroking my hairless head. "Doesn't that look appetizing?" she said again, mocking me this time. I realized that my legs were in agony, and I saw that there must have been a dozen needles poking out of my skin and through the pajamas she'd dressed me in. She pressed a finger against one, and for a second the pain became so white-hot that I nearly passed out all over again. I fought hard to stay awake, desperate to avoid another feeding. Good God, it was awful, and I didn't want any of that milk. Although, after thinking it through, a part of me wondered if I wanted to endure a second feeding while I was awake. But when it all came down to it was just her in my way, wasn't it? And that hatred inside me burned like a fire, and I realized that I wouldn't mind dying all that much. I'd secretly hoped for so long that I could maybe fix this somehow, maybe even get back to normal and get my body back. I didn't know how, but I'd let myself think that it could be possible. Sitting there looking at her loom over me, I decided that living like this wasn't really an option anymore. My hands were free. Who could blame her for leaving them like that? I couldn't hit her or kick her. I didn't have the reach or the strength. But I did have something sharp, so I reached down and tore a needle free, and before she could try and get it out of my hand, I shoved it right into her palm. It went right through like she'd been made of nothing more substantial than some thick wool. It didn't even make a noise, although the stench she emitted became unbearably strong, and she looked angry. Good, I thought, and I reached down and grabbed another one, and this time she tried to be quicker, but it just meant her face got closer to me. So close that the moonlight hit it, and for a moment I hesitated because I finally saw just how fucking god-awful she really was. You could see where all that skin was just slipping away and hanging loose like a badly made mask and whatever was underneath. It looked like a little spider. Not a spider's face, mind you. No, like she had a spider for a face. Only it was a spider with too many legs that were all curled up like it had been stamped on a few times. Like her whole skull was a ball made out of furry rubber bands. But she still had eyes, and they looked mostly human. And like I said, she'd gotten in so close I could see those hairs twitch and wriggle, and that meant I could lunge forward and jam that needle right in her eye, pushing so hard that by the end it was so embedded in the palm of my hand as it was in her skull, or whatever it was that she had. I don't know what exactly was in there, but it must have hurt, because she let out a scream that drew blood from my ears, and she ran off into the dark, desperate to get far, far away from whatever had caused her pain. I didn't have much time. I slipped loose from the chair and ran from the house, stopping only long enough to catch a glimpse of a shadow passing over the house, as if something had flown over. It's hard to say what exactly, but I had a vague notion that some of the lampposts in the nearby street were moving, and that they reached way, way, way too high in the sky. Holy shit, I felt her leave, and it was like the popping of a cyst. It hurt bad. It hurt like nothing I'd ever felt. It wasn't a protracted injury, just more like being shot, I imagine. I don't know. I reached the gate and saw somehow that my hand dwarfed the lock, and by the time I'd fumbled it open, I was already hurtling towards the ground like a falling tree. When I woke up, the house was blazing, and I felt like I'd just eaten 150 pounds of raw meat. But at least I was the right size again. I wound up having to take a trip to the hospital that same day so they could get the remaining needles out of my leg. I was laughing so damn hard that they wound up keeping me for my own safety, which, well, I guess I can't blame them for. Between the needles and the children's clothes and the way I screamed with joy at the sight of my own hands and my hairy arms, I guess I must have really looked like a loon. I can't imagine what they thought when I walked in wearing a fucking diaper. I didn't feel too bad about being stuck in that place though, and they didn't keep me for that long. Then they said something about the spores in my lungs. I don't know. I don't even care. I did tell them what happened, of course, but they told me it was all just a product of my mind. They say that my head is messed up, that I'm insane. I mean, they say it a little more politely than that, but that's the gist. They showed me a scan of my brain, and it looked like an apple after it had spent 3 weeks on the ground in mid-August. I guess I'm not an accountant anymore. Most days, I'm lucky if I can even work a remote job. I don't really care though. For a long time, she kept leaving me a packed lunch on the doorstep of my new apartment, which is completely nuts, but I almost ate one or two of them. It was that strong of a habit, a packed lunch. But instead, I always made a big show of throwing the food right in the bin. I always made sure to make a big scene, rip the brown bag apart, throwing the apples and bananas and everything else all over the place. At one point, I even took the apple juice and chocolate milk and dumped it all over my fucking head. Even my neighbors across the street thought I was nuts. Who could blame them? The last brown bag was full of divorce paperwork, although it didn't look official. More like a bad joke, but isn't that the whole point of marriage? It's just a bad joke. And so I signed them in crayon, told her that I was done with this role play for good, and left the bag outside.